Thank you, everybody. David Roach again, Independent Strategy, Quantum Economics. The subject is climate change. Not the first time we've talked about it, but it is an important moment to do so. The COP26 conference, which is the UN Climate Change Conference, takes place on Sunday, October the 31st, and lasts until Friday, November the 12th. Now, in case you don't know what COP26 means, it means the 26th conference of parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, more or less the Paris Agreement. It's a very long name. In fact, it's such a long name, it is semantically almost doomed to failure. And frankly, I think so is the conference. Let me give you the reasons why I think it will achieve very little, but why we should not totally abandon hope. It is this. Number one, some of the world's greatest emitters of greenhouse gas are simply not going to be there. Let us start with China, which is responsible for 26% of global emissions. China is not coming. Because, of course, it's in a Cold War with the West. And importantly, I think it is much more likely to snow in the Sahara in August than it is that China will achieve its targets or commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason for that is we've just seen China run out of electricity and the economy have severe turbulence as a result, because the head of the party or the leadership decreed that less filthy coal should be burnt in order to achieve climate goals. Less filthy coal was burnt, and the result was that China's 70% of electricity supply from coal went down the drain and the economy virtually stopped. So we've had a big reversal of that, which I can tell you about by looking out the window here in Hong Kong, where the air streaming in under the northerly winds from China is turning its normal yellow, wintry sulfur color, whereas up till we had a small reversal of climate change goals, it was relatively clear, and we could, on a good day, see the moon and the stars on a good night. It seems to me that China will fulfill its climate goals in terms of its statistical compliance, but the reality will be that it won't because it can't. I also think the idea of sacrificing economic growth and the pursuit of the last dollar on the face of the earth in the name of the abstract gains of climate change is not in the genes. It's not in the culture, and there's a long way to go before it is. It is far more likely that China will become a free rider, doing much less than its goals, much less than the stabilization of the world climate needs. But it will benefit from the fact that a number of other areas in the world will be doing something serious about greenhouse gas emissions. That is called free riding in economic terms. The US, of course, under the honest Joe Biden, the world's good citizen, will turn up at the meeting. The US emits 13% of global greenhouse gases. But the slight problem with the US is that it actually doesn't have a climate policy. I can demonstrate that very clearly. The US exited under Donald Trump, whose intellectual prowess included saying that climate change didn't exist and denying the science, and re-entered it under Joe Biden. But of course, the Paris Accord, or anything like it, has never been passed by the US Congress and never could be. The reason is the US citizens love their gas-guzzling cars. The coal lobby is very strong. The oil-producing areas are in the main governed by threatening Republicans to the Democrats, and they'd never go along anyway. So the US has, let us say, cultural ambitions and absolutely no policy on the ground. So its attendance at the conference is essential from the point of view of creating a kind of agreement about what should be done, but in actually executing it, sorry to say, but I don't think it's going to happen. And then we have, of course, the lovely Russia, which has an economy which in current dollars is worth about the same size as Italy. And if you take purchasing power parity, which means the country is poor and things are cheap, if you don't happen to try and survive in Moscow, which is an outrageously expensive city, then Russia has an economy which is about 2.5 times, 3-4 times the size of Italy. It emits 6% of world greenhouse gases, which actually is vastly understated for forest fires and the melting of the tundra. But of course, Mr. Putin is much more interested in getting fossil fuels out of the ground than he is in actually stopping it and helping climate change. His goal at the moment is simply to blackmail Europe into opening a new pipeline for gas, which would increase Europe's dependence on Russia beyond the 44% it already gets of its gas from Russia, and create major geopolitical problems, which frankly is perhaps the single biggest indictment of the beatification of Merkel, who left Germany not only with her own party being totally in disarray and dysfunctional, but left Germany with a dependence on Russian gas, which is totally unnecessary, and which is, of course, now being used by Putin to throttle back, if not on the gas under long-term contracts, but at least Gazprom is not supplying any short-term booster supplies, which it normally would do if the price was where it was. And it is also promised that it's not going to fill up its immense underground German storage units to help out with the European crisis. Mr. Putin, however, says, of course, we could send more gas if only you would open the pipeline, which is up to the new German government. In fact, there's over 50% capacity available in the pipelines that already exist from Russia to Europe. And the fact that he doesn't want to pump the gas is not because there is not enough gas, not because they could not pump the gas, not because Russia could not deliver the gas. It is because Putin, being the nice man he is much more intent upon blackmailing the EU than anything else. So Russia's not going to do anything about fossil fuels. It's going to make more of them. And then, of course, there are places like Australia, which under its present government is busy subsidizing, investing in, expanding capacity for fossil fuels, particularly in coal, but beyond coal, also in LNG. So Australia is off on a trajectory, a flight path of its own, which makes it really a pariah in terms of the world doing anything about greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the result of all this is very simple. It is that already 1.5% increase, 1.5 centigrade increase in global temperatures was baked in the cake. If you ask me for my very humble opinion, I think as a result of this stunning conference, we will probably hit 2.5 to 3.5 centigrade degrees increase in global temperatures by, let's say, the turn of the century, which will result in, as you can see already, more failed states. It will result in our children's children fighting each other for medication, for water, for food, and forget about education. And it will result, of course, in many wars between countries. They may not be global scale world wars, but they can be extremely nasty without much effort of the imagination. Okay, now we have published several videos about this. I don't want to be a complete doomsdayer because actually there are mechanisms for achieving a reduction in greenhouse gases emissions which are market driven, if they are let do their work. If they are let do their work against the self-interest and selfishness and greed of the coal lobby, the gas lobby, and of course the power generators. One of our videos was quantum loops, how positive forward-feeding loops could save the planet. We looked at the fact that the pricing of renewables was now competitive enough to ensure that they would disrupt the traditional fossil fuel industry. And if they were allowed to do so, then there would be knock-on effects beyond the actual energy markets into terms of electric cars and to have food production and so on. But the rewilding of the oceans, the rewilding of land, etc. So there's plenty of hope if you leave it to the private sector. And then 2 months ago, we produced Climate Destruction, Government Posturing, and Market Disruption, which was our first attempt to actually look at the subject which I've just described in the ways that I just described it. So I'm not totally bereft of hope, but I do not expect the politicians, the European and American ones, because they are essentially populists whose pain threshold is too low for them to accept, in reality, the pain of greenhouse gas emission curtailment. So climate change policies which are put into effect, the short-term pain of that is too great. And the long-term gains, which are huge, because the long-term gain includes actually humanity still being there. So it rather shifts the needle on your favorite investment from a zero terminal value to an infinite terminal value, because you're still around to get it and it's still around to deliver. But that's not the way politicians think. Politicians in our economies cannot possibly accept the sort of pain which is necessary in order to achieve the gains which would come as a result. Now, that's so much for democracy and populism. I don't think the autarkic leaders are going to do really any better, because essentially they are just as vulnerable to economic disappointment and the lowering of expectations among the masses in political terms as Western politicians are. They are much better at working out what needs to be done. They are in the main more intelligent than our leaders here. But effectively, when it actually comes to putting it into practice in economies which are still very much state-driven, heavy sector, state-owned enterprise dependent, and big fossil fuel consumers in terms of electricity supply, it is very hard for them too to accept the short-term disruptions, the short-term pain for long-term gain, which will be borne out long after they have exited the scene. So I'm not particularly hopeful for them either. There is one place, and I want to focus the rest of this presentation on that one place, where we can see climate change policies actually at work. Now, you may like them or dislike them. I'm not asking you for your vote, but they are being implemented and they are working. And actually, they're an automatic pilot, and they're going to go on being implemented. They're going to go on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that is in the European Union. Now, the European Union has a Fit for 55 plan, and it is all about cutting greenhouse gas emissions. Let us recap for a second that the EU greenhouse gas emissions are already approximately 20% below the level of 1990. And about 80% of all EU carbon emissions are covered by climate change policies of taxing and pricing of carbon. 60% of EU production capacity for electricity is either nuclear, which you may like or dislike it, and it is shrinking if you don't, but it is, in greenhouse gas terms, a zero emission source of electric power. So 60% of electricity production capacity is either nuclear or renewables in the European Union, which is quite a lot. The growth in capacity is actually in solar and wind, while nuclear shrinks. It's actually down from around 20% at the peak to 13% of electricity capacity, and it will shrink more, because one of the climate messes, one of the energy messes which Angela Merkel has left Germany and therefore Europe with, is the fact that she, in a populist fashion to grab the green vote from the Green Party, she actually promised and executed to phase out the nuclear industry in Germany, which she replaced in all her wisdom and foresight, her visionless politics, she replaced it with coal, which makes Germany actually the core center and by far the biggest, by a factor of 2, coal burner in the European Union when it comes to power generation. Okay, now the goals of EU Fit for 55 are a further 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and to be totally climate neutral, i.e. no greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The main instrument for achieving this will be the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, EU ETS for short. It currently prices CO2 at approximately $70 a ton, which roughly speaking is twice the level of Canada and a little less than twice the level of New Zealand. So it is by far the highest priced CO2 carbon emission economy in the world, which means that it is imposing reform, emit less greenhouse gases, or a much higher cost upon the sectors which are covered by the EU ETS. Now, how does the mechanism actually work? Well, the EU determines a price cap on the maximum annual emissions of the total European Union, and it then distributes the carbon allowance for that amount. So the number of tons which the European Union is allowed to emit, it distributes that and splits it up in 1 ton of CO2 equivalents to all of the member states. So they all get a slice of the cake. The member states then auction off that allowance, or they allocate it if they are favoring one industry over another to companies in the covered sectors. Those companies can then trade the allowances with each other. So it works like this. Carbon is going to cost you this much. If you emit more than your allowance, which is, let's say Y, if you emit Y plus X, then you have either at the end of the year got to buy X from the market at $70 a ton, which hits your profits, or you have to undertake mitigation to stop your company emitting carbon so that X becomes 0. That's how it actually works. At the end of the year, all of the businesses covered by the EU ETS must surrender allowances equivalent to the emissions that they caused. So they either have to give back what they got in the beginning because they didn't emit any greenhouse gas during the year, or they have to have bought an amount of carbon emission permits that would allow them to be carbon neutral. So again, we come back to the point, with the pricing of CO2 at $70 a ton, corporations either have to meet the target which is allocated to them from the national government, who gets it from the EU, and no more, or they have to buy in an amount equivalent to the surplus, the excess that they emit over and above their allowance. And they have to return all of those permits, what they are permitted, plus what they have to buy in at the end of every year, which of course is a big encouragement to them cutting their emissions, because otherwise they're going to have to pay out a lot of money. Now, the aim for Fit for 55 is to tighten the supply of carbon permits in 2023. And then there will be a decline every year in those carbon permits, called caps. At the same time, the aim is to increase the ETS coverage. How would this be done? Well, first of all, there will be no more free aviation caps by 2026. So flying around the place, take the train. And I hope the train is not using electricity from coal-fired power stations, but basically, aviation is going to pay the cost of its emissions by 2026. And there is going to be a new ETS fund specifically targeted at buildings, which are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, and road transport. That's the extension of the system which is built in. Now, there is an important aspect of the EU ETS, which is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Why do you need a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or a CBAM? We're getting to a lot of little complicated names here. The reason is, if I am making filthy widgets with filthy code, and you impose a carbon cap on me, which is going to cost me a lot of money, not only because the cap is expensive itself, but also because I'm going to have to buy in a lot of carbon caps or permits from the market, because I produce much more than my allowance, for which I probably have to buy in the marketplace in the first place. So all I do, I'll move to China or Vietnam or Bangladesh. I'll move my production, and I will make the same filthy widgets with the same filthy, or different, but nevertheless filthy coal. And I will then export all that stuff back to the EU, which will then be able to say that their greenhouse gas emissions have declined. But if you add imports to the greenhouse gas emissions, then of course they have not declined, because it is the consumption of the goods which actually is adding to global, world greenhouse gas emissions. So in order to prevent that sort of free riding, a name we've come up with before, you have to have a border tax. Now that border tax basically equates the carbon emissions of the product being imported from a foreign country into the EU with the standards of the European Union. So the carbon product, which is coming into the EU, the filthy widget, which I make now in Dudu in Duduland, that has to pay the full carbon cost emissions of the European Union. So lo and behold, if you just take greenhouse gas emissions, there is no longer any motivation for me to shift production to get away from EU greenhouse gas taxes. Because if I do, I will simply pay them when I try to import my product into the European Union. That is the idea. And it actually, at the moment, only covers cement, iron, steel, aluminium, fertilizer, and electricity imports. But that range is going to be expanded. So when you want to go out in 5 years or whatever, and buy your little dinky winky Halloween costumes with witches' hats and threatening gargoyle masks made in a foreign country, you're going to pay the full carbon cost of that product, irrespective of where it is made. How does this actually work? Well, the importers have to buy what are called CBAM certificates, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism certificates, and that equates the internal carbon cost in the EU with the external imports from outside the EU, which do not incur at their place of production or shipment the full cost of the greenhouse gases involved in making and delivering them. Now, there are a few slips between cup and lip, which is, are these carbon border adjustment mechanism equating taxes going to remain purely greenhouse gas based? Or are they going to switch from being purely economical to being political? For example, at the moment, France does not like Australia very much. There's a story about submarines going on there someplace, which we don't need to cover here. We have already. But would it not be possible within the EU that suddenly we would see a huge increase in the carbon border adjustment mechanism taxation of Australian products as they came into the EU? Let's say their coal or their alumina or their LNG. So the issue of whether this adjustment mechanism will remain apolitical is rather important. I think personally undecided, and I hope it will remain focused on its purpose of limiting greenhouse gases. Okay, now let's try and think about this all and wrap it up in terms of economics. Well, the simple side is to say the sectors most affected will be electricity production, transport, aviation, and consumers will have to pay for that. What that actually means is an increase in inflation. And often by itself, you might say, well, that's not very good. And maybe consumers and households will no longer, and voters will no longer support the EU program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there are many slips on the way to reaching that conclusion. One of them being that this is a bureaucratic program, which is being put into effect at a level which voters do not get to vote on. It's well underway. It's already having an effect, and it is most unlikely to be reversed. So do not forget that the way of doing things in the European Union, actually, if they are intelligent programs, ensures that they do not become populist defeats. But on the other hand, of course, the overall democratic accountability of the European institutions is at times a bit doubtful. But let's think for a moment about green investment and the EU New Generation Recovery and Resilience Fund, which was passed a few months ago. Now, that fund is a separate EU program, but it is called the RRF, Recovery and Resilience Fund. It is part of the EU New Generation program, which is a very vast program to get Europe moving after the pandemic, and also to bridge the economic gap between North and South, and hopefully also the quality of the management of the South compared to the North, bridge a little gap going on there. Of the European RRF Fund, Recovery and Resource Fund, Resource and Recovery Fund. Sorry, I got that wrong. There's so many little names around here. It is the EU Recovery and Resilience Fund, RRF, 750 billion euros. 37% of that fund must be allocated to climate action. In addition to that, 30% of the European Union's 1.2 trillion euro budget between 2021 and 2027 has to be allocated to climate action. That is a total, if you add it all up, that is a total of 3.8% of European GDP spread over 7 years. So it's not 3.8% per year, it's 3.8% total of GDP for 7 years. The biggest beneficiaries are actually countries which need help. Greece, Romania, Croatia, and of course, Italy, and then Spain. All of these countries get a greater than 4% of GDP for green projects, and double that in terms of the amount of money being invested by the RRF. The effect of this is not to crowd out the private sector, but to crowd it in. Because this state sponsorship is a productive investment, and there's no reason to assume that climate change investment, green investment, is not as productive as anything else, it will crowd in the private sector. And the crowding in is a very key factor. It has to happen, because in order to meet greenhouse gas emission goals by 2050, 2025, the two goals that we have been talking about, further cuts of 55% and then zero emissions, there has to be additional investment over and above what I have described from the RRF and from the EU budget and from the Fit for 55 project. There has to be additional investment equal to 0.5% to 1% of EU GDP per year. So roughly put, and the arithmetic is not terrific because GDP keeps moving per year, you would need to get approximately 3.5% to 7% of European GDP from the private sector invested in green projects to achieve the targets of the EU for greenhouse gas emissions in either 2025 or 2050. One of the things which we've got to remember about the combination of the program of Fit for 55 and the RRF and the funds allocated from the EU budget itself. One of the things we have to remember is that a substantial part of these funds are transfers between the North and the South under strict control and guidance principles. So in other words, you're not just signing a check for Greece, you're actually monitoring, you're approving and monitoring at an EU level specific projects to which these funds are allocated. So it's a very different deal from a kind of sovereign debt crisis bailout, which also has its monitoring, of course, but this is geared towards specifically targeted investments. As I said, approximately half of the total amounts are going to be environmental investments, and the other half are related to infrastructure investments like telecommunications, wiring the country, and so on and so forth. But these are not generalized handouts. These are specific investments. Now, who are the winners and losers? Well, of course, it's not difficult to see, and indeed, the politics of the moment make it even more clear that fossil fuel producing independent countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Romania get very hardly hit. And of course, that is one of the reasons why the countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechia are making such a fuss, and not just about abandoning fossil fuels, but they're generally calling into question the whole legal principles upon which the EU is based. And these two things are not a coincidence. They're actually linked. Now, the winners are the green technology countries, such as Finland, Austria, Estonia, Latvia, of course, Germany, and Denmark. These countries have not only got, Germany has a huge coal problem thanks to Merkel's inspired move to close down nuclear power and replace it with coal. Germany's got an absolutely massive problem about use of fossil fuels for electricity production, which it has to address, but it also has the technology in order to address it. But needless to say, jobs are going to be lost in the traditional industries, and they're going to be created in the new technology, the new green technology industries. Right now, at the moment, just taking that job figure, green jobs in the European Unions between 2014 and 2018 actually increased by about 340,000. Now, of course, that is just the beginning, but one should not think that implementing climate change policies simply destroys coal miners' jobs. It does destroy coal miners' jobs and people's jobs in the power industry, the electrical power industry, which are related to coal as well. Those jobs go. But there is a creation of jobs, and that creation of jobs could run at 700,000 to 1 million jobs a year. So there is an offset, which is a positive offset. But again, the bottom line is that the positive demand and supply shocks have to be bigger than the negative supply shocks that the total level of climate control policies by the EU, and that the fiscal transfers, of course, probably have a multiplier which is above 1, so they are a positive 1. Higher energy prices are a negative, but it really depends on where the proceeds from those higher energy prices, which are essentially taxation gathered by greenhouse gas carbon permits and by taxing the emitters at the border or within the borders. What is done with that money? Well, of course, part and parcel of it goes into the approximately 3.5% of GDP we just traced as being put by the EU into investment to achieve its greenhouse gas goals. And part of it will be used to compensate consumers in order to offset the increase in their energy bills. And indeed, that is already happening in countries like France. So you have to use a part of the proceeds from taxing greenhouse gas emissions to offset the costs of doing so to the consumer. That is very important to maintain support. And then we have the positive effects of green investment, which are just as productive as any other form of investment, I would pretend. And we have the positive effects within the European Union of the North-South transfers, which are part and parcel of this whole program. And I think the North-South transfers, under proper policing, management, and monitoring, can be a very positive aspect in boosting the idea and the reality of economic reform in Europe's weaker, economically speaking, southern states. And that is essential to the continued existence, not only of the European Union, but the euro. So that is a rather long lesson in greenhouse gas emissions and climate control, about which at a global level, I am not optimistic, though I think there are private sector, free market solutions, which if they are allowed to operate and not interfered with by traditional sector, fossil fuel sector lobbies, can do a lot of the heavy lifting, but not all of it. And I think that the European Union is ahead of the game. And it is very important that having a policy that is already being implemented should be understood by students of the world like ourselves, so that we can know and have a benchmark about what other areas and countries could do, can do, will do, or won't do. Goodbye, good night, and don't turn the lights off. They may well turn themselves off when all this greenhouse gas emission control starts to cut the emissions. Bye-bye.